Chapter 6 Belly of the Beast. Outskirts of the Jakku system. Resurgent class Star Destroyer Ravager.
Making final touchdown now.
When he heard the unmistakable metallic sound of landing gears touching down on a hard platform, along with the sudden hiss of decompressing air, Poe's stomach dropped. He had a feeling he knew where he was, and when the ramp to their transport fell to the floor, that much was confirmed.
Move it!
The troopers on either side of him pushed him roughly by the shoulder, and he stumbled onto the flight deck. When he did, though, his eyes went wide. All around him was the bowels of the next-generation Star Destroyer, probably a battle cruiser based inside of the hangar. It had been over 20 years since the New Republic had even an inkling to the technological advancements the Imperial remnants had been cooking up, and here it showed.
Get up!
He felt a rough hand on his shoulder, and he instinctively shook away. A blaster rifle came up to his face, and he held up his restrained hands.
You know, I got nowhere to go, Buckethead, so you might as well relax.
Funny. Move.
He was shoved roughly, and he started walking. That, of course, didn't stop him from taking mental notes. What immediately surprised him was the number of droids walking around.
Nothing on scanner.
I'm telling you, it's there.
Visual scan negative.
You stupid droid, it's right there.
Bite my shiny metal boom.
Oh, criff you.
Of course, there were plenty of personnel dressed in navy gray uniforms performing various tasks, but the droids outnumbered them 3-1 in that regard. The droids in question looked like upgraded B-1s, adorned in black and red markings. That made him wonder why. Did the First Order lack the necessary bodies to man their ships, so they made up the difference with droids? That would probably explain their use of droid fighters, but where did they get that resources out in the unknown regions? Another odd quirk he picked up were the officers, distinguished from the other crew members with their black trousers and white blouses.
Shop it up, officer.
You have the honor of serving me now.
Well, that's just swell.
They spoke of overpronunciated Coruscanti accents that reminded him of the planet's upper political echelon. Even the stormtroopers spoke with vaguely urban-sounding Coruscanti, with even variety to them.
Some things never change. You've gotta be kidding me.
He whispered at the sight of the next-gen TIE defenders lining the walkway, the six-winged craft perched like birds of prey. The Defender program had been the boogeyman of his academy days, the brainchild of the infamous Grand Admiral Thrawn in the early days of the Rebellion. These fighters were a match, sometimes even superior to the X-Wing. He remembered the program had been shut down due to rebel sabotage, mounting production costs, and of course the fact Thrawn had been mysteriously reassigned to the unknown regions to deal with some crisis, the details of which were still classified to his pay grade. And yet, here they were again, and that made him wonder how.
Move.
He was shoved along, giving him a chance to observe the craft in more detail. He noted that there were two variants, painted black and white with crimson flight marks. There was the stock version, similar to the old TIE D. However, the second was longer and bulkier, with an expanded cockpit. He craned his head, noticing an underslung blaster cannon connected by a gyro, all pointed backwards. Combined with a number of cameras likewise pointed that way, he suspected these modifications were meant for a secondary gunner.
Although that be the case, at what cost?
He then turned left, and across the massive hangar was yet another railway, this time for a line of bomber Poe had only ever seen the blueprints for during flight school. The TIE PN, or Punisher, was an advanced variant of the TIE Bomber, with additional missile and bomb pods, and what he suspected to be a shield generator. Poe shuddered at the thought of them in action, and part of him was glad that they hadn't been deployed en masse to Jakku. He had already seen the gruesome work of similar bombercraft in both the Outer Rim and the Antica system.
Open the blast doors.
What other toys are these guys packing?
He thought to himself as the door shut behind him with a hiss. Phasma hadn't said a word on the ride back, the empty seats making up half the dropship haunting her. Echo 2-1 hadn't been the only unit to receive casualties. Echo 2-3 had been wiped out to a man, and every fire team had suffered a casualty. It wasn't particularly singular, but every death weighed heavily on her mind. In retrospect, the casualty projections for the assault had been considerably higher, but even these many were hard. However, the situation of FN 2187, or 87, as his men had called him, was unique in a morbid sense. Though others had died, Their squads were still relatively intact, with brothers alive to aid in the grieving process. Phasma cursed softly. Those who claimed the bondness of her troopers and the subsequent grieving for lost comrades was a weakness were fools. She learned long ago that family was everything. You could lose everything, but you still had family. You still had the tribe. Phasma sighed wearily as she looked down at the trooper in question, seated across from her with his head hung low. She knew what it meant to be the last of her tribe. She knew all too well.
Making touchdown! Welcome home, troopers!
The ramp hissed open as it clanged to the floor, and the troopers departed. Phasma was the last to leave. 87 hadn't moved when the others departed. Instead, he continued to wallow in sorrow, holding his head in his hands.
FN 2187.
The trooper looked up, the bloody handprint shining brightly against the hangar backdrop. Phasma stared at him for a long moment before she commanded,
Take off your helmet, trooper.
87 did not immediately respond to the order. Any other time, such disobedience would have received an immediate snap of her voice. Instead, she calmly repeated the command.
Take off your helmet, trooper.
87 stared at her again before nodding somberly. When he removed the helm, she could clearly see his stained cheeks. His eyes averted downward, his silence telling. She shook her head softly, and with a subtle hiss, revealed the face many in the Corps regarded as mother.
87.
The name caught the trooper's attention.
I read your platoon leader's reports. There was nothing you could have done differently. You did your job the best you could.
My men are dead and I'm not. Phasma closed her eyes. She could see it. The young girl of 16 left in a radioactive desert, her family in graves before her. I should have died with them, 87 uttered, almost at the moment she herself remembered saying those words all those years ago.
No. There's no need to waste another life, trooper. Especially not yours.
I failed them, Mom. I promised to get them out alive, and I failed them.
And you would fail them if you died needlessly.
He didn't respond. He continued to stare at the floor as though it were alive. She sighed, taking a seat next to the younger man, staring at the same floor.
I know what it is like.
He looked her way, and she continued.
To have everything you know, everything you grew comfortable with, just disappear. That the memory you carry stings until it becomes venom in your soul.
He continued to stare at her, his expression unreadable.
And one day, you end up catching yourself wishing that none of it ever existed, so that you could be spared the burden of carrying it. It never gets easier. It just becomes something else.
They sat in silence of the craft for a long length. They might have even sat for hours, if not for the flight crew coming in to make repairs. As the two of them rose and returned their helms, the captain took him by the shoulder.
I'm putting you on reserve status until I can determine you're fit for active duty again.
You're sending me back to the colonies?
She nodded.
However, I want you to report to Psych 8 at 1500 hours tomorrow for evaluation. Until then, get some rest.
Ma'am.
She stopped and turned.
Yes, trooper?
The pilot we captured. What's going to happen to him?
The same as all our enemies. Interrogated for information, disposed at a later date.
87's stare, even behind the helmet, was unusual. One that she didn't fully understand in that moment. She smiled slightly, though.
Do not worry about such matters, trooper. Rest.
She about-faced and continued her march, calling at her calm.
Justice will come to him soon enough.
Dawn rose over the horizon as BB-8 ascended the hill, overlooking the previous night's slaughter. Smoke rose from the center in oily blacks and grays, the remains of the homes and buildings scorched into rubble like tombstones. The signs of war lay heavy, and all the droid could do was close his eye and shake his head. Part of him had wanted to come back, to just keep running into the desert and maybe find a way off-world. But he couldn't do it. He couldn't run knowing his friend might still be out there looking for him. He rose somberly from his spot and made his way down to the center of the village, where piles and piles of bodies had been tossed into a bonfire. Grimly, he began scanning them, detecting that he'd been shot first before being burned.
They wanted to hide the evidence, or at least delay its discovery.
He pulled up Poe's medical file. Facial identification was impossible now, so you'd have to do a dental examination. He popped his skeletal arms and began the minutes-long process. He was glad he wasn't organic. He was sure the process would have made him sick if he was. But in the end, he was relieved when he was finished. Poe wasn't in the pile. In fact, most of the men were John Does with no medical history. Suddenly, a fresh identification came to his processors, and he spun around.
The old man.
He hovered over the remains, his examination indicating that he had been killed by a penetration to the chest cavity. What was odd was that it had an exit wound in direct line with the entry wound, and both had been seared with a heat greater than the fire that had cooked the body, greater even than a blaster burn. There was only one weapon on his medical records that had those sort of characteristics, and the thought made him shudder. Was it ironic that Lore's son had been skewered by a lightsaber? He didn't know, and he didn't care. He gave a final glance to the old man, nodded solemnly, and moved on. He still had to find Poe, and time wasn't on his side. For the next several minutes, he searched every nook and cranny, piling over stone and ruin but finding nothing. Hopelessness crept into his mind, and BB-8 considered turning around and getting out of this pit before he found himself joining dead. However, there was one more section of the village he hadn't checked, and this had more promising results. There was an old adobe house on the far side of the village, with 8-foot holes in the walls. They hadn't been made by blaster fire, but instead had been made by blunt force.
Doors were bad for a reason, but no! We have to go and smash through walls like that giant pitcher from the drink commercials.
Inside were signs of a battle with blaster birds everywhere but no bodies. He was about to turn around when he saw something glinting in the sunlight. His eyes widened as he realized what it was. He carefully picked it up, staring at it for a long moment. He had never held a lightsaber before, so he feared he could be excused for being curious. He held it in both hands and ignited it. The cobalt flame burned like the brightest flame, and BB-8 almost dropped it out of fright. But he held it, feeling a kind of wonder as he stared into the flame. After a moment, he deactivated it and stored it safely inside his internal compartments. It didn't feel right leaving it here. He quickly made his way out of the village, coming to the conclusion Poe had been taken by the enemy. There was nothing left for him to do but complete the mission. He might not see his friend again, but he was sure that his sacrifice would not be in vain. As the sun rose in the east, BB-8 set out for what lay beyond, in the miles of shifting scarlet sand. Far behind him, the blaster bolt that had been frozen in place by Kylo Ren finally flew and detonated against the wall.